The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a dust-covered postal rider who looked half dead from the journey. Eliza Granger watched from behind the faded curtains as Mrs. Mert signed for the delivery, her weathered hands trembling slightly. The envelope bore her name in careful script: Miss Eliza Granger, care of Mrs. Mart's boarding house, Independence, Missouri. She waited until evening to open it, sitting by the narrow window in her attic room where the light was best. The paper felt rough between her fingers. Nothing like the fine stationery the ladies in town used. The handwriting was steady, purposeful. Miss Granger, it began. My name is Matthew Klenn. I own a ranch outside Devil's Throat in Wyoming Territory. I am 34 years old, in good health, and seeking a wife. I do not promise wealth or comfort, but I can offer a home without violence and work that brings honest reward. If you are willing to consider this arrangement, I await your reply. Eliza read it 3 times before setting it down. Her fingers unconsciously moved to the gap in her teeth, a reminder of the last time she'd trusted a man's promises. That had been 2 years ago, when Thomas Brennan's fist had taught her the difference between words and actions. She'd fled in the night with nothing but the clothes on her back and bruises that took months to fade. Mrs. Mert found her still sitting there an hour later. The older woman's face had grown gaunt these past weeks, the consumption eating away at her from the inside. She lowered herself onto Eliza's narrow bed with effort. "Another proposal?" she asked, nodding at the letter. From Wyoming Territory, a rancher. Mrs. Mert coughed into her handkerchief, the spots of blood barely visible in the dim light. Might be worth considering. Child, I won't be here much longer to keep this roof over your head. The truth of it sat heavy between them. Eliza had worked for her board these 2 years, cooking and cleaning for the handful of travelers who still stopped at the failing boarding house, when Mrs. Mert died. And it would be soon. The bank would take the property. Eliza would be back on the streets with winter coming on. That night, she wrote her reply by candlelight, choosing each word with care. "Mr. Klenn," she began, "I received your letter before you send fare for my passage. You should know the truth. I am 28 years old, neither young nor beautiful. I have no dowry, no family, and no prospects. I can cook, sew, tend animals, and keep house. I am not afraid of hard work or harsh weather, but I will not tolerate being struck. If you can accept these terms, I will come." She posted it the next morning, walking through the pre-dawn darkness to catch the mail coach. Mrs. Mert died 3 weeks later, on a cold October night with the first frost settling on the windows. Eliza closed her eyes, arranged her hands, and sat vigil until the undertaker came. The reply from Wyoming arrived 2 days after the funeral. Inside was a train ticket and $20 for expenses. His note was brief: "Your terms are acceptable, Matthew Klenn." The train journey took 5 days. Eliza shared a car with 3 other women, all heading west for similar reasons. Mary Sullivan, barely 18, clutched a photograph of a man she'd never met. Sarah Barnes kept her bruised face turned toward the window. The 4th woman never gave her name, just stared at her folded hands and whispered prayers in German. The landscape changed as they traveled, from the rolling hills of Missouri to the endless plains of Kansas and Nebraska. By the time they reached Wyoming Territory, the world had become alien, vast stretches of sagebrush and distant mountains that looked like broken teeth against the sky. The November wind cut through the train car's thin walls, and Eliza pulled her shawl tighter. Devil's Throat was the last stop before the wilderness swallowed the rails entirely. The platform was nothing more than warped boards and a lean-to that served as a station. Eliza stepped down into air so cold it burned her lungs. Dust swirled around her skirts, and she squinted against the late afternoon sun. A handful of men waited on the platform, all eyes tracking the women who disembarked. Mary Sullivan was claimed immediately by a young man with pomade-slicked hair. Sarah Barnes hesitated before approaching an older gentleman in a merchant's suit. The German woman slipped away toward the church at the far end of the street. Eliza stood alone with her single carpet bag, scanning the faces. She'd formed no picture of Matthew Klenn in her mind, afraid to imagine him either too kind or too cruel. Better to face the truth without expectations. He separated himself from the shadows by the station wall, a tall man, perhaps 6 feet, with shoulders broadened by years of physical labor. His face was weathered but not old, with deep lines around gray eyes that had seen too much. He wore work clothes, clean but mended, and a hat that had lost its shape to sun and rain. When he moved toward her, it was with the careful gait of someone who'd learned not to startle. "Miss Granger." His voice was low, roughened by tobacco or dust or disuse. Eliza straightened her spine and met his gaze directly. "Mr. Klenn." He studied her for a moment, taking in her plain dress, her worn boots, the defensive set of her shoulders. Then he reached for her bag. "The wagon's this way." She followed him to a buckboard that had seen better decades. The mule in the traces looked sturdy enough, though its winter coat was already thick with coming cold. Matthew helped her up to the bench seat, his touch brief and impersonal, then swung up beside her. They rode out of Devil's Throat in silence, the town falling away quickly into the vastness of the territory. The road, if it could be called that, was little more than wagon ruts carved into the earth. Eliza gripped the seat as they jolted over rocks and through gullies. The sun was setting by the time he finally spoke. "It's 2 hours to the ranch, be 3, maybe, in the dark. There's a buffalo robe behind the seat if you're cold." She was cold, freezing actually, but she kept her hands folded in her lap. "I'm fine." He glanced at her sideways. "No shame in keeping warm, Miss Granger. Winter comes hard out here." After another mile of shivering, she reached back for the robe. It smelled of smoke and animal, but the warmth was immediate. She caught what might have been approval in his expression before he turned back to the road. Stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, more than she'd ever seen in Missouri. The silence between them wasn't comfortable, exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the quiet of 2 strangers measuring each other, testing boundaries that would define their future. Finally, as the moon rose over the distant mountains, she asked, "Why did you send for a wife, Mr. Klenn?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Been out here 8 years? A man alone too long. He forgets how to be human." Figured it was time to remember. It was honest, at least, more honest than promises of love or prosperity. Eliza pulled the buffalo robe higher and settled in for the long ride to whatever awaited her at the end of this unmarked road. The ranch emerged from the darkness like a collection of broken promises. In the moonlight, Eliza could make out a cabin that leaned slightly eastward, as if perpetually braced against the Wyoming wind. The fence posts stood at drunken angles, more suggestion than barrier, and what might have been a barn looked ready to collapse at the next strong gust. Matthew pulled the wagon up beside the cabin and climbed down without ceremony. "This is it," he said, reaching up to help her down. His hands were steady on her waist for the brief moment it took to set her on the ground. Inside, a single oil lamp revealed the sparse interior. One main room served as kitchen, dining, and living space. A cast-iron stove dominated one corner, cold now, with a few pieces of cookware hanging from nails in the wall. A rough table with 2 mismatched chairs sat near the window. Through a doorway, she glimpsed a narrow bed. "That's yours," Matthew said, following her gaze. "I'll take the loft." She noticed the ladder leading up to a space above, barely high enough for a man to sit upright. He was giving her the only real bedroom, the only privacy. It was more consideration than she'd expected. "I'll get your bag," he said, and disappeared back into the night. Alone. Eliza surveyed what would be her new home. The floors were packed dirt, swept clean but uneven. Gaps between the wall boards would let in wind and snow come winter. The whole place smelled of old smoke, leather, and something indefinably male. the scent of a space too long without a woman's touch. She tested the bedroom door. It had a latch but no lock. When Matthew returned with her carpet bag, she was examining the hinges. "Door sticks sometimes," he said. "Been meaning to plane it down." "Is there a lock?" He set down her bag and met her eyes. "No, never saw the need." He paused, seeming to understand. "There's a chair. You can wedge it under the handle if it makes you feel safer." That first night, she did exactly that. She lay fully dressed on the narrow bed, boots still laced, listening to Matthew moving about in the loft above. Every creak of wood made her tense. When he finally settled, she remained awake for hours more, staring at the door and the chair braced against it. Morning came with pale light through the single window. Eliza rose, stiff from sleeping in her clothes, and ventured into the main room. Matthew was already gone, but he'd left the stove burning and a pot of coffee warming. She found bacon, beans, and a few eggs in the makeshift pantry. By the time he returned from whatever dawn chores had called him, she had breakfast ready. He stopped in the doorway, seeming surprised. "You didn't have to." "I said I could cook." She set a plate on the table. "I meant it." They ate in silence, but she noticed him glance at her several times. When he finished, he pushed back his chair. "I'll be working the north fence today. There's a spring out back for water. Wood piles on the east side. Anything you need, just ask." After he left, Eliza began her inventory. The kitchen supplies were minimal but serviceable. The floors needed proper sweeping. The window, singular, was so dirty she could barely see through it. She found a rag and bucket and set to work. By midday, she'd transformed the grimy glass into something approaching transparent. Light flooded the room, revealing both its shabbiness and its potential. She moved on to the floors, then the surfaces, working with the same methodical determination that had kept her alive these past years. In a trunk beneath the window, she discovered remnants of a previous life, a woman's life, a few pieces of clothing, too fine for ranch work, a Bible with Catherine Klenn, written on the inside cover in delicate script, a wedding photograph of a younger Matthew standing beside a pretty blonde woman who smiled at the camera with confident ease. Eliza closed the trunk carefully. Whatever had happened to Catherine Klenn was none of her business. She was here to work, to earn her keep, not to probe old wounds. That evening, Matthew returned to find the cabin transformed. The floor was swept, the surfaces clean, his few dishes washed and organized. A stew bubbled on the stove, filling the space with warmth and the scent of cooking meat. He stood in the doorway longer this time, taking it in. Haven't seen the place look like this in a while. It needed doing. Eliza ladled stew into bowls. Uncomfortable with anything approaching praise, they developed a routine over the following days. Matthew rose before dawn, leaving coffee and stoking the fire. Eliza prepared breakfast, then spent her days attacking years of neglect with soap, water, and determination. She mended his clothes, discovering shirts held together more by habit than thread. She organized the pantry, making lists of necessities for the next trip to town. At night, she still wedged the chair under her door handle. She still slept in her boots. On the fourth day, she found a bottle hidden behind the flour sack. Whiskey, half empty, the cork loose. Her hands trembled as she held it, remembering Thomas Brennan's breath, hot and sour with drink, before his fist would find its mark. She set the bottle on the table where Matthew would see it. That evening, he stopped short at the sight of it. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. They ate dinner in heavier silence than usual. When she rose to clear the dishes, he finally spoke. "I drink sometimes. Winter nights get long." She kept her back to him, scrubbing a pot with unnecessary force. "And when you drink, I go to the barn, sleep it off with the horses." She turned to face him then, searching his weathered features for the lie. But his gray eyes were steady, waiting. "I won't be hit," she said quietly. Not again. I'll leave first. Snow or no snow? I heard you the first time. Miss Granger, in your letter. He stood, picked up the bottle, and walked to the door. She watched from the window as he emptied it onto the ground, the amber liquid disappearing into the thirsty earth. When he came back in, he went straight to the loft without another word. But the next morning, the coffee was ready as always, and beside her cup sat a small iron key. For the bedroom door, he said without looking at her. Found it in the barn. She tested the key that night. The lock was stiff with disuse, but functional. For the first time since arriving, she unleapt her boots before bed. It was a small freedom, but freedom nonetheless. As the days passed, the sharp edge of her wariness began to dull. Matthew kept his distance, speaking only when necessary, but his actions revealed a careful consideration. He never entered her room. He announced himself before coming into the cabin. He left her portions of whatever game he hunted, already cleaned and ready for cooking. One evening, as they sat by the stove after dinner, him repairing harness, her patching one of his shirts, she found herself stealing glances at him. In the lamplight, the harsh lines of his face softened slightly. His hands, so large they made the leather straps look delicate, moved with practiced precision. Why did you really send for a wife? The question escaped before she could stop it. He didn't look up from his work. Told you, a man alone. There's more. She kept her eyes on her sewing. The clothes in the trunk, the photograph. His hands stilled. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind testing the walls. Catherine died 6 years ago. Fever took her in 2 days. Nothing I could do. His voice was flat, factual. Buried her on the hill behind the north pasture. Tried to keep the place up after, but... He gestured at the cabin around them. You can see how that went. I'm sorry. He resumed working the leather. She was a good woman. Deserved better than this place. Better than me. He glanced up briefly. I'm not looking to replace her. Miss Granger. Just thought maybe it was time to stop living like a ghost. Eliza understood ghosts. She'd been one herself these past 2 years. Haunting misses. Mart's boarding house. Afraid to be seen. Afraid to be real. Maybe that's what had brought her here. Not desperation, but the faint hope of becoming solid again. That night, she left her door unlocked. It was a small gesture, possibly foolish. But Matthew had earned that much trust. She still kept the key close, still slept light, but the chair remained in its proper place by the table. When morning came with its familiar routine, coffee made, fire stoked, Matthew already gone to his work, she stood at the clean window and watched the sun rise over the vast Wyoming landscape. For the first time since Thomas Brennan's fist had taught her the price of trust, she felt something that might have been the beginning of peace. The gunshot shattered the pre-dawn quiet like glass. Eliza bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, she was back in Missouri. Thomas Brennan drunk and waving his pistol at shadows. But the bed beneath her was narrow and hard, the air cold with Wyoming winter, and Matthew's boots were already thundering down from the loft. He grabbed his rifle from beside the door, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. Stay inside, he commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. Bar the door behind me. Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness beyond the threshold. Eliza stood frozen for a heartbeat before rushing to drop the heavy bar across the door. Her hands shook as she pressed her eye to a gap between the boards, straining to see anything in the moonless night. Minutes crawled by. 5, 10, 20. No more shots. No sounds except the wind rattling the loose barn boards. When the knock finally came, she nearly jumped out of her skin. It's me, Matthew's voice, tired and cold. She lifted the bar and he entered, bringing the scent of gunpowder and winter air. His face was grim in the lamplight. What was it? She asked. Nothing good. He set the rifle back in its place. Found tracks around the chicken coop. Boot prints. Not from my boots. Someone was here. The words chilled her more than the draft through the walls. Wolves. Wolves don't wear boots, Miss Granger. He moved to the stove, stoking the dying embers. And they don't shoot at the sky to let you know they've been visiting. She wrapped her shawl tighter. Who would? Could be anybody. Drifters, rustlers, men who think a lone rancher might be easy pickings. He glanced at her, something unreadable in his gray eyes. Or men looking for something specific. The weight of his words settled over her like snow. She'd been here 3 weeks now, long enough for word to spread. A woman at the Clen Ranch, a stranger from back east. Maybe someone had put pieces together, sent word to Missouri. I didn't tell anyone, she said quickly. Where I came from. I didn't. I'm not accusing you of anything, his voice gentled slightly. But if there's something I should know, now would be the time. Eliza sank into one of the mismatched chairs, her legs suddenly unsteady. The story she'd kept locked inside for 2 years clawed at her throat, demanding release. Matthew waited, patient as stone, while coffee heated on the stove. His name was Thomas Brennan, she finally said. He owned the general store in Cedar Falls, Missouri. My parents owed him money when they died. He said I could work off the debt. She stared at her hands, seeing again the ledger where the numbers never decreased, no matter how many hours she worked. The debt kept growing. Everything I needed, food, clothes, a place to sleep in his storeroom, got added to what I owed. After a year, I understood I'd never be free of it. That was the point. Matthew poured 2 cups of coffee, set one before her. The warmth against her palms gave her courage to continue. He started drinking more, started saying I belonged to him, that he'd bought me fair and square. When I disagreed, she touched the gap in her teeth unconsciously. He had papers, he said, legal documents, a judge who owed him favors, in Cedar Falls. Thomas Brennan's word was law. So you ran. In the middle of the night, 2 years ago, took nothing but the clothes I wore. She met his eyes then. He swore he'd find me, said he'd drag me back to Missouri in chains if he had to. That I was his property, and a man doesn't let his property just walk away. Matthew's expression had darkened during her tale, a muscle working in his jaw. No man owns another person. Miss Granger, war settled that question. War didn't settle anything in Cedar Falls. They sat in silence while dawn crept across the sky. Finally, Matthew stood. I need to check the perimeter, see if our visitor left any other calling cards. You know how to use a rifle. I can aim and pull a trigger. He retrieved an older rifle from the loft, checked it, handed it to her along with a box of ammunition. Anyone comes while I'm gone who isn't me. You point this at them and tell them to move along. They don't move. You shoot. Clear. She nodded, gripping the weapon. After he left, she loaded it carefully, the way her father had taught her before fever took him and her mother both. Then she resumed her watch at the window, the rifle across her lap. The sun was full up when 3 riders appeared on the horizon. Eliza's breath caught. They moved with the lazy confidence of men who expected no resistance, spreading out as they approached the ranch. She recognized the formation. She'd seen it before when Brennan's friends came to the store, circling like wolves, testing for weakness. Matthew emerged from the barn, rifle casual in his hands, but ready. The riders stopped just outside comfortable shooting distance. The one in the middle, a thin man with a face like spoiled milk, smiled without warmth. Morning, Clen. Jedediah. Matthew's voice carried no welcome. Bit far from town, aren't you? Just passing through. Thought we'd be neighborly. See how you're settling in with your new arrangement. Jedediah's eyes swept toward the cabin, and Eliza shrank back from the window. Word is you've got yourself a woman from back east. Must be nice, having some comfort through the cold months. My business is my own. Sure. Jedediah shifted in his saddle. Thing is, we heard tell there might be some unfinished business regarding that woman. Legal matters. You might say, man back in Missouri offering good money for information. Eliza's hands went white on the rifle stock. They knew. Somehow, they knew. Matthew took a step forward. Anyone with business on my land can state it to me direct. Otherwise, I'll thank you to move along. The rider on Jedediah's left, younger with cruel eyes, laughed. Awful protective of property that might not rightly be yours. Clen. The lady is under my protection. That's all anyone needs to know. Lady, the cruel-eyed one snorted. From what we hear, she's more like... Matthew's rifle swung up so fast Eliza barely saw the movement. Choose your next words careful. Samuel, real careful. The tension stretched taut as wire. Jedediah raised a placating hand. No need for unpleasantness. We're just conveying information. There's a man willing to pay $500 for the whereabouts of one Eliza Granger. Thought you should know what kind of trouble you might be harboring. I know exactly who's under my roof. Now get off my land. Think about it. Clen, Jedediah said as he turned his horse. $500 could buy a lot of comfort. More than some runaway piece of... The rifle shot split the air, kicking up dirt inches from Jedediah's horse. The animal reared, nearly unseating its rider. Next one won't miss, Matthew said calmly. Already levering another round. The three men wheeled their horses and galloped away, but their laughter carried back on the wind. Eliza knew that sound. It was the laughter of men who'd be back, who saw weakness and would worry at it like dogs with a bone. Matthew stood watching until they disappeared over a rise. When he finally turned back to the cabin, Eliza was standing in the doorway, her rifle still clutched in trembling hands. $500, she said numbly. That's more than most men see in 2 years. I'm not most men. He'll come himself, eventually. Thomas Brennan doesn't like losing what he thinks is his. Matthew climbed the steps, gently took the rifle from her hands. Then he'll find out this isn't Missouri, and I'm not impressed by his money or his connections. You don't understand. He has friends, influence. Miss Granger. His voice was firm but not harsh. Eliza, look at me. She raised her eyes to his weathered face, surprised by the use of her given name. I wrote to you because I was tired of being alone. You wrote back because you were tired of being afraid. We made a bargain, you and I. His hand covered hers briefly, warm and calloused. I don't break my bargains, and I don't let anyone take what's under my protection. Not for $500. Not for $5,000. Understood. The fierce certainty in his voice broke something loose in her chest. For 2 years she'd run, hid, made herself small and invisible. But here was this man, this stranger who'd become familiar, standing ready to fight for her right to simply exist. I won't bring destruction on you, she whispered. If it comes to it, I'll leave. If it comes to it, we'll face it together. That's what the bargain means. He squeezed her hand once, then stepped back. Now, I could use some breakfast. Defending homesteads works up an appetite. She followed him inside, marveling at his steady calm as she cooked. She watched him clean both rifles methodically, preparing for whatever came next. When he caught her looking, something passed between them. Not quite affection, not yet, but a recognition. They were two damaged people making a stand together against a world that would grind them down separately. That night, for the first time, she didn't lock her bedroom door. If trouble came, she wanted no barriers between her and the man who'd chosen her side. She slept with the rifle beside her bed, but she slept soundly, knowing Matthew kept watch in the loft above. The war for her freedom was coming. But for now, in this moment, she was no longer alone in the fight. The smell of smoke woke her first, acrid and wrong in the cold night air. Then came the sound, a crackling roar that didn't belong to the wood stove. Eliza threw off her blankets as Matthew's boots hit the floor above. Fire! He shouted, already sliding down the ladder. The barn! Through the window, orange light danced against the darkness. The barn was ablaze, flames licking up the dry boards like hungry tongues. Eliza grabbed her boots, fumbling with the laces as Matthew snatched his rifle and rushed out. She followed, the December air shocking her lungs. The heat from the barn pushed against them even from 30 feet away. Inside, the horses screamed. "The water bucket!" Matthew thrust his rifle at her and ran toward the inferno. "Cover me!" Eliza raised the weapon, scanning the shadows. This was no accident. Someone had set this fire, and they might still be watching. Movement caught her eye near the corral fence. Without thinking, she fired. The figure dove behind a post as Matthew emerged from the barn, leading his mare with one hand and dragging a bucket with the other. More gunfire erupted from multiple positions. Eliza dropped behind the water trough, splinters exploding from the wood as bullets struck. Matthew released the horse and rolled behind an overturned wagon, his pistol appearing in his hand. "How many?" he called. "3, maybe 4. The barn roof collapsed in a shower of sparks, illuminating the yard like hellish daylight. In that moment of brightness, Eliza saw him clearly, a man rising from behind the chicken coop, rifle aimed at Matthew's position. She didn't remember pulling the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the man spun and fell. Her first kill. She expected to feel something: horror, guilt, revulsion. Instead, there was only a cold clarity. These men had come to take her back to slavery. She would not go. "Good shot," Matthew returned fire, keeping 2 attackers pinned near the fence. The remaining horses burst from the barn, maddened by fear and flames. They charged through the yard, scattering the attackers. In the chaos, Eliza saw her chance. She broke from cover, running low toward Matthew's position. A figure lunged from the shadows. Young Samuel, the cruel-eyed rider from that morning. His hands reached for her, and time slowed. She saw his face twisted with greed, saw the rope coiled at his belt meant for her wrists. Her body remembered Thomas Brennan's hands, the helplessness, the pain. Not again. She swung the rifle like a club, catching him across the jaw. He staggered, and she hit him again, harder. He dropped, groaning. She grabbed his pistol and kept running, diving behind the wagon as bullets whined overhead. "You hurt." Matthew's eyes swept over her, checking for blood. "No, but they're trying to flank us." He nodded grimly. "On 3. We make for the cabin. Ready." But before he could count, a voice called from the darkness. "Clan, this doesn't concern you. Send out the woman and we ride away. Nobody else has to die tonight." "Go to hell, Jedediah," Matthew shouted back. $500. "Clan, that's more than this dried-up ranch makes in 3 years. Be smart." Eliza gripped Matthew's arm. "Maybe I should—" "Don't." His voice was iron. "Don't even think it." "Last chance," Jedediah called. "The woman, or we burn you out like we did your barn." Matthew's answer was 3 rapid shots toward the voice. In the return fire, they ran. Eliza had never moved so fast, her feet flying over the familiar ground. They burst through the cabin door together, Matthew immediately barring it while Eliza took position at the window. "They'll torch the cabin next." She said, "Let them try." Matthew was already moving, pulling up floorboards to reveal a hidden cache more ammunition, an old scattergun, and several bottles of clear liquid. Catherine insisted we needed a fallback. Never thought I'd use it. They prepared in efficient silence. Years of frontier survival compressed into minutes. Eliza loaded weapons while Matthew positioned furniture to create cover. Outside, the barn continued to burn, casting writhing shadows across the yard. "There," Eliza spotted movement. "Coming from the east. 2 figures approached, carrying burning brands pulled from the barn's wreckage. Matthew took aim through a gun port he'd cut years ago, waiting until they were close. The scattergun boomed, and both men went down screaming. That's 4 down, Eliza said steadily. Can't be many more. A bottle crashed through the window, trailing flame. Matthew grabbed it and hurled it back out before it could spread, cursing as the hot glass burned his palm. Eliza tore a strip from her petticoat, wrapping his hand quickly. Behind you! She spun to see a man climbing through the back window. Her pistol was in her hand, firing before conscious thought. Once, twice, 3 times, he tumbled backward into the night. An eerie quiet fell, broken only by the dying barn's crackle. They waited, weapons ready, scanning for the next attack. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, horses, the sound of men riding hard, but away, not toward. Eliza counted hoofbeats. 2, maybe 3 riders fleeing into the darkness. Is it over? She whispered. For tonight. Matthew kept his rifle trained on the door. But they'll be back. Men like that don't give up easy when money's involved. They maintained their vigil until dawn revealed the carnage. 5 bodies scattered across the yard. The barn reduced to smoking timbers. Dead chickens in their burnt coop. But they were alive, and the cabin stood. Matthew walked among the bodies, checking faces. Local hired guns mostly. Jedediah must have run when things went bad. He stopped at young Samuel, unconscious but breathing where Eliza had clubbed him. This one's alive. What do we do with him? Matthew's face was stone. What do you want to do? She looked at Samuel's cruel young face, thought of what he'd intended. Part of her wanted to put a bullet in him, end the threat, but that would make her no better than Thomas Brennan. Let him go, she said finally. Let him carry word back. Tell them what happens to men who come hunting on this land. Matthew nodded approval. They dragged Samuel to his horse, tied him in the saddle, and slapped the animal's rump. It galloped off toward town, its semi-conscious burden bouncing like a grain sack. The rest they buried in a single grave beyond the hill, deep enough that wolves wouldn't dig them up. No words were said. These men had chosen their path and found its end. As they walked back to the cabin, exhausted and covered in soot, Eliza noticed a paper pinned to the door with a knife. Matthew tore it free, read it, and handed it to her. The woman belongs to Thomas Brennan of Cedar Falls, Missouri. She is stolen property. Return her or face the consequences. This is legal notice. Eliza crumpled the paper, letting it fall. He's coming himself. This was just the first wave. Then we'd better be ready. Inside, as they cleaned weapons and assessed damage, Eliza found herself watching Matthew's steady hands, the calm set of his shoulders despite the night's violence. He'd killed for her, risked everything for a woman he'd known barely a month. Why? She asked suddenly. He looked up from the rifle he was cleaning. Why what? Why fight for me? You could have taken the money, could have sent me back and been done with it. He was quiet for a long moment, then set the rifle aside. My parents came west in '49. Settlers killed them when I was 12, took everything, including my sister. Said Indians don't count as people, so it wasn't really murder. His gray eyes met hers. I know what it's like to watch someone you care about get dragged away by men who think they own the world. Won't watch it happen again. The weight of his words settled between them. Eliza moved without thought, crossing the space to where he sat. Her hand touched his face, feeling the stubble and the warmth beneath. He went still, watching her with those steady eyes. I won't let them take me, she said softly. I'll die first. Nobody's dying. His hand covered hers, rough and gentle at once. We've got food, ammunition, and defensible ground, and now they know we'll fight. She leaned down and kissed him then, tasting smoke and coffee and determination. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was fierce, desperate, a claiming between 2 people who'd found something worth defending. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw her own wild hope reflected in his eyes. Together, she asked. Together, he confirmed. Outside, the sun rose over the destroyed barn and the churned earth of battle. But inside the cabin, two scarred souls began to believe they might actually survive this war. They turned the cabin into a fortress. Matthew hauled stones from the creek bed, and together they chinked every gap in the walls with mud and clay. The window, their single vulnerability, they reinforced with thick boards, leaving only narrow slits for shooting. Eliza suggested they dig a shallow trench around the cabin's perimeter, hidden beneath a thin layer of dirt and snow. "Learned that from my father," she said, helping Matthew sharpen stakes. "He fought in the Mexican War. Said the best defense is the one your enemy doesn't see coming." They worked through the bitter December days, their breath clouding in the frigid air. At night, they took turns keeping watch, one sleeping while the other sat guard with rifle ready. The intimacy of their kiss hung between them, unspoken but present in every glance, every accidental touch. On the fourth day, Matthew announced he was riding to town. "That's foolish," Eliza protested. "They'll be waiting." "We need supplies, more ammunition, food for winter." He strapped on his gun belt. "And I need to send a telegram." "To who?" "Judge Harrison in Cheyenne. He's circuit, but he's honest. Need to get our side on legal record before Brennan's money starts talking." She wanted to argue, but saw the sense in it. "I'm coming with you." "No. If something happens to me, you fort up here. There's enough food for 2 weeks, ammunition for longer." "Matthew." He caught her shoulders gently. "This is my choice, Eliza, my risk. You've carried this burden alone long enough." He left at dawn, and she spent the day in agony. Every distant sound might be gunfire. Every movement on the horizon could be riders returning with bad news. She cleaned weapons that were already spotless, organized supplies that didn't need organizing, and wore a path in the floor from window to window. The sun was setting when she finally saw him, a lone rider moving fast across the snow-covered plain. Her relief turned to alarm as she noticed he was slumped in the saddle. She threw open the door as the horse stumbled into the yard. "Matthew!" He half fell from the saddle, his coat dark with blood. She caught him, staggering under his weight, and helped him inside. His face was gray with pain. "Ambush," he gritted out. "Outside town. Got through, but—" She cut away his coat, revealing a deep gash along his ribs where a bullet had gouged flesh. Not fatal, but bleeding heavily. She'd tended enough injuries at Brennan's store to know what to do. "This will hurt," she warned, heating a knife blade over the stove. "Do it!" She cleaned the wound with whiskey, then cauterized the worst of the bleeding. Matthew bit down on a leather strap, his body rigid with pain, but didn't make a sound. When she finished bandaging him, his eyes were glassy with shock. "The telegram?" she asked. "Sent. Judge will be here in 2 weeks." He managed a weak smile. "Also bought ammunition. It's in my saddlebags. If those buzzards didn't steal it." She retrieved the supplies, finding not just ammunition but a small paper-wrapped package. Inside was a simple gold ring. "Figured we should make it legal," Matthew said, watching her from the bed she'd helped him to. "If you're willing. Makes it harder for Brennan to claim you if you're my wife under territorial law." Eliza turned the ring in her fingers, this practical proposal so different from anything she might have once dreamed. But dreams were for people who hadn't learned the world's harsh truths. "Yes," she said simply, slipping the ring on. It fit perfectly. They were married that night, speaking simple vows by lamplight. No preacher, no witnesses. Just 2 people making promises in a fortified cabin while danger prowled outside. When Matthew kissed her, careful of his injury, it tasted of commitment and defiance. The next days blurred together. Matthew healed slowly, frustrated by his weakness. Eliza took over the outside chores, feeding the surviving horses, hauling water, keeping watch. The empty horizon mocked her with its silence. On the 7th night, 2 young men approached under a white flag. She recognized neither, but kept her rifle trained on them as they stopped just within shouting distance. "Mrs. Clen," one called. We've got a message from town, from the doctor. Speak it and go. There's been sickness. Bad water, he thinks. Lost 6 people already. The young man shifted nervously. Your husband bought medical supplies when he was in town? Doctor's asking if you can spare any. He'll pay fair price. Eliza hesitated. It could be a trick, but if people were truly dying... Leave the money on that stump, she called. Then ride back to those rocks. I'll leave what I can spare. The transaction completed without treachery. As the riders departed with precious medicine, one turned back. Ma'am, folks are talking about what happened here. About you standing against those hired guns. He touched his hat. Just wanted you to know, not everyone in Devil's Throat agrees with taking blood money. After they left, Eliza told Matthew about the exchange. He nodded slowly. Good. We'll need allies if this goes to trial. That night, the temperature plummeted. Wind howled through the reinforced walls, and ice formed on the water bucket. They moved Matthew's bed near the stove and huddled together for warmth, her body careful of his healing wound. Tell me about Catherine, she said into the darkness. He was quiet so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, she was everything I wasn't. Educated, refined. Her father was a banker in Chicago. She came west to teach school. Ended up teaching me instead. You loved her. I did, but it was careful love, polite. She tried to civilize me, make me fit for society dinners and church socials. His arm tightened around her. This is different. You don't want to change me, you just want to stand beside me. I want to survive, Eliza corrected. Everything else is secondary. No, he said softly. Not anymore. Not for either of us. Morning brought fresh snow and fresh tracks. Someone had circled the cabin in the night, testing their defenses. Eliza found marks where they'd tried the door, the reinforced window, but the fortifications held. They're getting desperate, Matthew said, examining the tracks. Brennan must be putting pressure on. That afternoon, a lone rider approached, a woman, heavily bundled against the cold. Eliza recognized Mary Sullivan from the train, though her young face had aged years in weeks. Please, Mary called, her voice breaking. I need help. My husband, he's hurt bad. Every instinct screamed trap, but Eliza couldn't ignore the desperation in the girl's voice. What happened? Those men, the ones hunting you. They came to our place, demanding food and shelter. When Robert refused, she broke down sobbing, against Matthew's protests. Eliza saddled a horse. I'm going. Keep watch. If I'm not back by dark, bar the door and don't open it for anyone. She followed Mary across the frozen landscape, rifle across her lap. Every sense alert. The Sullivan homestead was smaller than theirs, newer, with the raw look of recent construction. Robert Sullivan lay on a narrow bed, his legs splinted and face fevered. Broke it running from those bastards, he wheezed. Pardon my language, ma'am. Eliza examined the break clean, thankfully, but infected where bone had torn skin. She did what she could, cleaning and rebandaging, leaving herbs for the fever. Why help us? Mary asked. We're strangers. Because someone has to start choosing differently, Eliza replied. Has to start saying no to men like Brennan and yes to each other. She rode back through gathering dusk, pushing the horse hard. The cabin appeared exactly as she'd left it, but something felt wrong. The door stood slightly open, heart pounding. She approached carefully, rifle ready. Matthew? In here. It's safe. She found him standing over 2 bodies in their main room. Young men, barely out of their teens, both shot clean. Came in through the roof, he explained, pointing to the hole they'd cut. Thought they were clever. Together, they dragged the bodies outside. 5 dead from the first attack, now 2 more. How many more would Brennan send to their deaths? That night, as they repaired the roof by lamplight, A wolf howled in the distance. Others answered, their voices rising in an ancient chorus that seemed to speak of territory and blood and survival. Eliza and Matthew worked in silence, understanding that they too had become something wild, something that would fight to the death for its small piece of earth. "Judge Harrison better come soon," Matthew said finally. "And if he doesn't—" He looked at her across the damaged roof, his gray eyes reflecting the lamplight like a wolf's. "Then we make our own justice." The ring on her finger caught the light as she hammered, this symbol of belonging that was also a declaration of war. Whatever came next, she was no longer Eliza Granger, runaway property. She was Eliza Clenne, and she would not yield. The attack came at midnight, swift and vicious. No warning shots this time, no negotiations, just the sudden crash of axes against the door and the thunder of boots on the roof. Eliza jerked awake to Matthew already moving, pressing a rifle into her hands. "Kitchen window," he commanded. "They're trying to flank us." She rolled from the bed fully dressed. They'd been sleeping in their clothes for days now, and took position. Through the narrow gun slit, she saw them 5 men moving through the darkness like wolves. One carried a torch, ready to set fire to their home. The Spencer rifle bucked against her shoulder. The torchbearer spun and fell, his flame extinguishing in the snow. The others scattered, seeking cover. Behind her, Matthew's scattergun boomed. Wood splintered as someone tried to force entry through the barricaded door. The cabin filled with gun smoke and the acrid smell of violence. "How many?" she shouted over the din. "Too many." A figure appeared at her window-scarred face, wild eyes, teeth bared in a snarl. She fired point blank, the man's expression changing from triumph to surprise as he toppled backward. Her hands mechanically reloaded. No tremor now, no hesitation. She'd become what survival demanded. Glass shattered somewhere. Matthew cursed. She heard him moving, furniture scraping as he shifted position. More gunfire. The sharp crack of rifles answered by the deeper boom of his weapons. Then she heard it, a voice that froze her blood. "Eliza May Granger." The voice was cultured, controlled, terrifyingly familiar. "This ends tonight. Come out, or I'll burn you out like the rats you are." Thomas Brennan. He'd come himself. "The hell she will," Matthew roared back. Eliza's hands tightened on the rifle. 2 years of running, 2 years of fear, and here he was, the man who'd tried to own her, to break her, to reduce her to property. Rage, clean and pure, burned through her veins. A bottle crashed through the damaged window, spreading flames across the floor. She grabbed the water bucket, dousing the fire before it could spread. Another bottle followed, then another. They were trying to smoke them out. "The tunnel," Matthews said, suddenly beside her. "Catherine insisted on it. Leads to the root cellar." "You go. I'll cover." Together or not at all. They fought their way to the bedroom. Matthew laying down covering fire while Eliza pried up the hidden trap door. The narrow tunnel beyond smelled of earth and old fears. She dropped in first, Matthew following, pulling the trap shut behind them. Crawling through darkness, they could hear boots overhead, angry voices. Smoke began seeping through the floorboards. They emerged in the root cellar, a separate structure 20 yards from the main cabin. Through gaps in the door, they watched their home burn. "There," Matthew pointed. "By the well." Brennan stood in the firelight, directing his men. He looked exactly as she remembered. Portly, well-dressed even for a raid, carrying himself with the arrogance of a man who'd never been denied anything. Beside him stood someone she didn't recognize, a lean figure wearing a deputy's badge. "Bought himself some law," Matthew muttered. 5 men searched the burning cabin. Others held the perimeter. Too many to fight directly, but Eliza had learned patience these past weeks, learned to wait for opportunity. It came when 2 men approached the root cellar. "Check that outbuilding," Brennan commanded. They might be hiding. Matthew positioned himself beside the door. Eliza crouched in the shadows, knife in hand, quieter than gunfire. The door opened. The first man entered, eyes adjusting to the darkness. Matthew's hands found his throat, dragging him down silently. The second man had time to grunt before Eliza's blade found the soft spot beneath his ribs. They dragged the bodies deeper into the cellar, took their weapons. Matthew peered out carefully. 3 by the horses, 2 with Brennan. Rest are watching the cabin burn. "The horses," Eliza said. "Stampede them. In the chaos." He nodded, understanding. They slipped from the cellar, moving low through the darkness beyond the fire's reach. The night that had been their enemy now became their ally. Years of frontier living had taught Matthew to move like smoke. Eliza followed, placing her feet where his had been. The horses were nervous, smelling smoke and death. It took only a slap and a shout to send them bolting. Men cursed, diving aside as hooves thundered past. In the confusion, Matthew shot one guard while Eliza took down another. "The root cellar!" someone shouted. They were in the root cellar. But Eliza was already moving, circling back toward where Brennan stood shouting orders. This man who'd haunted her dreams, who'd made her feel powerless. He looked smaller now, older, just a man made of flesh and fear like any other. She stepped from the shadows behind him. "Hello, Thomas." He spun, eyes widening. "Eliza, my dear, I've come to take you home where you belong." "I belong here." "You belong to me?" Spittle flew from his lips. "I have papers, legal documents. You're my property, bought and paid." The gunshot was thunderous. Brennan looked down at the spreading red stain on his vest, then back at her with genuine bewilderment. You shot me." "Yes." He fell to his knees, hands pressing the wound. "You can't. I own you." "Nobody owns me." He toppled forward into the snow. The deputy beside him went for his gun, but Matthew appeared like a ghost, rifle trained on the man's head. "Badge doesn't make you right," Matthew said calmly. "Drop it." The remaining men emerged from various positions, guns drawn but uncertain. Their paymaster lay dying in the snow. The woman they'd come to retrieve held a smoking gun with steady hands. "Anyone else?" Eliza asked, her voice carrying across the yard. "Anyone else think they own me?" One by one, they lowered their weapons. These were hired guns, not idealists. Without Brennan's money, they had no stake in this fight. "Take him and go," Matthew ordered. "Tell anyone who asks what happens to men who try to chain free people." They loaded Brennan onto a horse. He was still breathing, barely, mumbling about property and rights and things that no longer mattered. The deputy looked like he might protest, then thought better of it. Within minutes, they were gone, vanishing into the night like the phantoms they'd always been. Eliza and Matthew stood in their destroyed yard, watching their cabin collapse into embers. Everything they'd built together, reduced to ash and memory. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "About your home." "Our home," he corrected. "And we'll build another, better this time, stronger." She looked at him, this man who'd stood beside her against impossible odds, who'd never questioned her worth or her right to freedom. The ring on her finger caught the firelight. "I love you," she said, the words feeling strange and new on her tongue. His arms came around her, solid and real. "Been waiting to hear that. Even though I brought all this down on you. Especially because of that." He kissed her forehead. "You fought for yourself. That's worth more than any cabin." They salvaged what they could as dawn broke. Some tools from the root cellar, the horses that had wandered back, the hidden cache of gold Matthew had buried years ago. Not much to start over with, but enough. As the sun rose, Eliza stood where the kitchen had been, where she'd first learned to trust again. The ashes were still warm beneath the snow. She thought of the woman who'd arrived here weeks ago, scared of shadows and sleeping in her boots. That woman was gone, burned away like the cabin. What remained was harder, stronger, forged in fire and blood. "Ready?" Matthew asked, the loaded wagon waiting. She took one last look at the ruins, then climbed up beside her husband. They had friends now. The Sullivans, the doctor, others who'd witnessed their stand. They would rebuild, create something new from the ashes of the old. As they rode away, Eliza didn't look back. The past was dead, buried with Thomas Brennan's dreams of ownership. The future stretched ahead, vast and free as the Wyoming sky. She'd chosen this life, chosen this man, chosen to fight rather than run. And in that choosing, she'd finally found her home. The Sullivans offered their barn while Eliza and Matthew rebuilt. It was cramped quarters, a corner sectioned off with canvas, sharing space with horses and hay, but after the violence of recent weeks, the peaceful sounds of animals and Robert Sullivan's gentle snoring from the loft felt like sanctuary. Eliza woke before dawn each day, her body still trained to vigilance, but instead of checking for intruders, she now prepared breakfast for 4, Mary Sullivan working beside her in companionable silence. The young woman had proven surprisingly resilient, her initial fragility masking a core of prairie steel. "Never thought I'd be grateful for barn living," Mary said one morning, kneading bread dough. "But after what you've been through..." Eliza tested the coffee, adding more grounds. "We're alive. That's what matters." Through the barn's open doors, they could see Matthew and Robert hauling lumber salvaged from an abandoned homestead. Matthew's wound had healed cleanly, leaving only a scar to mark their ordeal. He moved with renewed purpose, sketching plans for their new cabin in the evening, discussing improvements with the quiet intensity she'd grown to love. The news of Brennan's death had spread through the territory like wildfire. Some called it murder. Others, particularly the women, spoke of justice. The deputy who'd accompanied Brennan had filed no charges, perhaps understanding how poorly his purchased badge would stand against territorial law. Judge Harrison finally arrived on a bitter February morning, his circuit delayed by blizzards. He was younger than Eliza expected, with keen eyes that missed nothing. He set up court in the Devil's Throat Saloon, the only building large enough to hold the crowd that gathered. "This isn't a trial," he announced, gaveling for order. "But I'll hear testimony regarding the events at the Glen Ranch." One by one, witnesses spoke. The doctor testified about treating men wounded in the first attack. Mary Sullivan, voice trembling but determined, told of hired guns threatening her husband. Even Jedediah appeared, his testimony bought by immunity, confirming that Brennan had hired men to retrieve what he called his property. When Eliza took the stand, the saloon fell silent. She spoke simply, without dramatics, telling of her years under Brennan's control, her escape, the attacks on their home. When she finished, several women in the audience were crying. "Mrs. Glenn," Judge Harrison said carefully, "you shot Thomas Brennan. Do you deny this?" "No, sir. I shot him to save my life and my freedom." Some would say you should have waited for the law. The law was standing right beside him, wearing a badge he'd bought. Her voice remained steady. "I chose to live free or die trying. I'd make the same choice again." The judge studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "The court finds that Elizabeth Glenn acted in justified defense of her person and property. No charges will be filed." He banged his gavel once, firmly. "Furthermore, let the record show that any claims of ownership over persons are null and void in Wyoming territory. We are not Missouri. We are not the past. Case closed." The crowd erupted. Some cheered, others muttered darkly, but Eliza heard none of it. Matthew was beside her, his hand warm on her back, and that was all that mattered. Spring came slowly to Wyoming, but by April, their new cabin was taking shape. They'd chosen a site closer to the Sullivans, understanding now the value of neighbors. The walls were thicker, the windows smaller but more numerous. Matthew included hidden spaces for weapons and supplies, while Eliza insisted on 2 exits and clear sight lines in all directions. "We're building a fortress," she said one evening, standing back to survey their work. "We're building a home," Matthew corrected. "That happens to be hard to burn down." They worked side by side, no longer the tentative strangers of months past. Eliza had learned to read his silences, to recognize the small smile that meant approval, the furrowed brow that preceded deep thought. In turn, he'd learned her rhythms, when to offer comfort, when to give space, when to simply stand beside her as an anchor in the storm. One morning, Eliza woke to find Matthew already gone, unusual for their established routine. She found him on the hill behind their rising home, standing before a small headstone she'd never noticed before. "Catherine," he said without turning. "Been meaning to introduce you." Eliza approached slowly, reading the simple inscription, "Catherine Mills Clenn, beloved wife, 1,844 to 1,869 inches." Today would have been her birthday. Matthew continued. "Used to come here to talk to her. Haven't since..." He trailed off. "Since I arrived. Since I started living again." He turned to face her. Felt wrong at first, being happy, like I was betraying her memory, but I think she'd understand. She always wanted me to be more than just existing. Eliza took his hand, studying the grave of the woman who'd loved him first. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for giving him back to the world." They stood together in respectful silence until the sun climbed higher, calling them back to the work of living. The cabin was finished by June, modest but sturdy. They held a raising party, neighbors coming from miles around to celebrate. Eliza found herself at the center of a quilting circle. Women who'd once eyed her with suspicion now sharing gossip and recipes. She'd sewn her new life into this community with thread as strong as any chain. That night, in their new bedroom with its 2 windows and solid door, Matthew presented her with a gift. A rifle, custom-made with a shorter stock to fit her frame. "Had it ordered from Cheyenne," he said, almost shy. "Figured you'd earned your own instead of borrowing mine." She ran her hands over the smooth wood, the well-oiled metal. It was beautiful in its functionality, deadly in its purpose, perfect in its understanding of who she'd become. "Teach me to shoot better," she said. Really shoot, not just point and pray. So their mornings expanded to include target practice, Matthew patiently correcting her stance, her breathing, her follow-through. She proved a natural student, driven by the knowledge that skill meant survival. One afternoon, as she consistently hit targets at 50 yards, he said, "You're getting dangerous. Mrs. Clenn." "Good," she replied, sighting down the barrel again. "I intend to stay that way." Summer brought unexpected bounty. Their garden flourished in the brief growing season. The surviving chickens multiplied. Matthew's small herd of cattle, protected now by better fences and watchful neighbors, began to thrive. For the first time in her adult life, Eliza felt the foreign sensation of plenty. She marked the feeling by making a new quilt, not from necessity, but from choice. The fabric came from her old dresses, the ones she'd worn while running, while hiding, while learning to fight. She cut them apart without sentiment, reorganizing the pieces into new patterns. The past transformed into something useful, something beautiful. "What'll you call it?" Mary Sullivan asked, admiring the emerging design. Eliza considered, running her hand over a section made from the dress she'd worn the night Brennan died. "Freedom," she decided. "I'll call it Freedom." As autumn approached, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rust, a letter arrived from Missouri. Eliza recognized the handwriting, Mrs. Mertz's niece, who'd inherited what little remained of the boarding house. "Thought you should know." The letter read, "Thomas Brennan's store was sold to pay his debts. Seems he owed more than he owned. His family left town in shame. Nobody speaks his name anymore. You're free, Eliza, truly free." She read it twice, then fed it to the stove. The paper curled and blackened, taking with it the last chains to her past. That night, she walked outside and stood under the vast Wyoming sky, breathing in air that tasted of sage and possibility. Matthew found her there, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "All right." "More than all right." She leaned into his warmth. "I'm home." They stood together, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, winter to prepare for, stock to tend, a life to build. But tonight, she was simply Eliza Klenn, a woman who'd chosen her ground and defended it, who'd found love in unlikely places and strength in necessary violence. The cabin behind them glowed with lamplight, solid and real. No longer a fortress against the world, but a foundation for the future. She'd built it with her own hands, board by board, just as she'd rebuilt herself, piece by careful piece. "Come inside," Matthew said eventually. "It's getting cold." She followed him in, pausing at the threshold to look back once more at the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, other women were running, hiding, surviving. She wished them courage, wished them strength, wished them their own moment of standing free under an endless sky. Then she closed the door and stepped into the warmth of home. 10 years had passed since the night Thomas Brennan fell in the snow. 10 years of seasons turning, of life taking root in Wyoming soil. Eliza stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching her son practice with the rifle she'd taught him to respect, but not to fear. James Matthew Klenn was 8 years old, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determined chin. He moved through the target drills with the same careful precision she'd learned. Understanding that skill meant survival even in these more peaceful times. "Breathe out slow. Jamie," she called. "Let the shot surprise you." The rifle cracked, and the tin can 50 yards out jumped off its post. The boy turned to her with a grin that was pure Matthew. "Good shot," she said. "Now clean your weapon." He nodded, settling on the porch steps with the practiced movements of a child raised to responsibility. As he worked, he asked the question she'd been expecting for months. "Ma, why do we live different from town folks?" Eliza sat beside him, considering her words. Through the window, she could see Matthew at the kitchen table, going over cattle prices with Robert Sullivan. The two men had become partners, their combined herds strong enough to weather bad years. "Different, how?" "The Hendricks boys say their ma doesn't know how to shoot. Says their PA doesn't let her touch guns." Jamie frowned, working oil into the rifle's mechanism. "And when I told them you taught me to read, sign, and track deer, they said that wasn't woman's work." "What did you say back?" "I said you weren't just any woman, your ma." She smiled, ruffling his dark hair. "The world's full of ideas about what men and women should be. Jamie, some folks follow those ideas. Others make their own path." "Like you and Pa." "Like us, yes." She watched him reassemble the rifle with steady hands. "Your father wrote to me when I was scared and alone. He offered me a chance at a different life. Not an easy life, but a free one." "Were you really a mail-order bride?" The term had reached even Wyoming's scattered homesteads, carrying its mixture of romance and desperation. "I was, but I became much more." She stood, looking out over their land, the sturdy barn, the flourishing garden, the cattle dotting distant pastures. "I became myself." That evening, after Jamie was asleep, she and Matthew sat by the fire as they did most nights. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and lines mapped years of sun and wind on his face. He was whittling a toy horse for the Sullivans' new baby, his hands as steady as ever. "Boy asked about us today," she said, "about how we met." "What'd you tell him?" "The truth, or enough of it." She set aside her mending. "He should know where he comes from." Matthew nodded slowly. "He should know all of it. When he's older, the fighting, the fear. Why we sleep light and keep weapons close. Why we taught him to watch the horizon, Eliza added. To know who belongs and who doesn't. They'd had scares over the years, drifters who eyed their prosperity with too much interest, hard men who recognized something dangerous in the way Eliza moved, the way Matthew watched, but word had spread through the territory. The Clen Ranch was no easy target. Most trouble passed them by, seeking simpler prey. A week later, Judge Harrison stopped by on his circuit. His hair was white now, but his eyes remained sharp. He'd become a friend over the years, one of the few who knew their whole story. Afternoon, Mrs. Clen, he said, accepting coffee gratefully. Heard there might be trouble brewing over at the Hendricks place. What kind of trouble? The kind you once knew. Seems Mr. Hendricks owes money to the wrong people. They're making threats about taking it out in trade. His meaning was clear, Mrs. Hendricks and her daughters were the trade in question. Eliza's jaw tightened. The law. The law says debts must be paid. Doesn't say much about how. He met her eyes meaningfully. Thought you should know. After he left, Eliza found Matthew in the barn. She told him what Harrison had shared. Watched his face darken with memory. We helping? He asked simply. We are. They rode out that night, leaving Jamie with the Sullivans. The Hendricks Ranch lay 15 miles north, a modest spread run by a man too proud to ask for help. They found him on his porch, rifle across his knees, watching the road. Clen, he said, surprised. Mrs. Clen, what brings you out? Heard you might have visitors coming. Matthew said, thought you could use extra hands. Hendricks' pride warred with desperation on his weathered face. I don't take charity. Not offering any? Eliza said, just neighbors helping neighbors. The way it should be. Mrs. Hendricks appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. Behind her, 2 teenage daughters clutched each other. Eliza saw her younger self in their frightened eyes. Thank you, Mrs. Hendricks whispered. They didn't wait long. 6 riders appeared near midnight, confident in their numbers. Their leader, a thin man with dead eyes, dismounted casually. Hendricks, time to settle up. Cash or trade, your choice. I need more time, Hendricks called back. Time's up. Send out the women, and we'll call it square. Eliza stepped from the shadows of the barn, rifle steady. The women aren't currency. The riders shifted, hands moving to weapons. Their leader squinted at her. This ain't your business, lady. I'm making it my business. Matthew emerged from the other side, flanked by Robert Sullivan and 2 other neighbors who'd answered the quiet call. Now ride on. 6 against 5. The leader calculated. I like those odds. Count again, Eliza said. Mrs. Hendricks and her daughters stood in the windows, rifles trained on the riders. Even at distance, their determination was clear. The leader's confidence wavered. This ain't over, Hendricks. Yes, it is. Eliza's voice carried the weight of old battles. You'll ride away now and not come back, or we'll bury you here. Choose. Something in her tone, in the way she held the rifle like an extension of her body, made the decision for them. They mounted and rode away, vanishing into the darkness. They'll be back, Hendricks said. No, Matthew said quietly. They won't. And they didn't. Word spread, as word does in the territories. The Clen woman had stood for the Hendricks family, the one who'd killed Thomas Brennan, who'd survived siege and fire. Men who preyed on the desperate learned to ride wide around certain ranches. Back home, Eliza found Jamie waiting on the porch despite the late hour. You went to help someone, he said. It wasn't a question. How did you know? You and Pa got the same look you do before storms, like you're ready for whatever comes. He studied her face in the lamplight. Were they bad men like in your stories? She sat beside him, this boy who'd grown up with bedtime tales of survival instead of fairy princesses. Yes, bad men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. But you stopped them. We stopped them. Your PA and me and others. Because that's what good people do. They stand together. Jamie nodded solemnly, then asked, "Will you teach me not just shooting and tracking, the other stuff? How to know when to stand and when to fight?" "When you're older. I'm old enough to learn some things." She looked at this child born of violence, transformed to love, raised in a home built on ashes. He would need the skills she could teach, but tempered with the wisdom Matthew provided. The world was changing, but not fast enough. There would always be those who saw others as property, who took what they wanted because they could. "All right," she said finally. "We'll start tomorrow." That night, she stood before the small mirror in their bedroom, brushing hair now streaked with silver. The woman looking back bore scars inside and out, but her eyes were clear, unafraid. She'd traveled far from that terrified girl reading a stranger's letter by candlelight. Matthew appeared behind her, his arms encircling her waist. "No regrets." She leaned back against him, feeling the solid truth of their life together. "None. You. Only that I didn't write sooner." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who'd found each other across miles and misery. Outside, the wind sang through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and snow. It was a hard land still, demanding and unforgiving, but it was theirs, earned in blood and held in trust for the next generation. In the morning, she would teach Jamie to read sign in the dirt, to understand the language of survival. She would show him how strength could wear a woman's face, how courage came in many forms. She would prepare him for a world that might test him as it had tested her. But tonight, she simply held her husband's hand and listened to their son's peaceful breathing from the next room. The mail-order bride who'd been too scared to trust had become a woman who stood guard over others' freedom. The circle was complete, but the story continued. "I love you," she told Matthew, words that still felt like both gift and promise. "And I love you," he replied, "my dangerous wife." She smiled at that, remembering the frightened woman who'd wedged a chair against her door. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder and softer both. Someone who could kill to protect but chose to build instead. Someone who'd learned that real strength lay not in standing alone, but in choosing who to stand beside. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. But in this small cabin on the vast Wyoming plain, love had taken root in unlikely soil. It had survived drought and storm, violence and loss. It would endure, passed down like the rifle skills and the hard-won wisdom, a legacy written in lead and courage and the simple act of choosing to stay. Eliza Clem closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds, owl calls and coyote song, the whisper of wind through grass. Once, they would have frightened her. Now they sang of home, of freedom, of a life carved from wilderness and will. She had been a mail-order bride, too scared to hope. Now she was simply, gloriously herself. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts about Eliza and Matthew's journey. Your feedback means the world to me.